in every single district in Massachusetts. This bar graph that you see in front of you indicates where North Reading stands. The light pink vertical bars are what North Reading spends, and the darker burgundy vertical bars indicates what the Massachusetts average are. So if you were to look at FY05, you can kind of see that North Reading is around $8,000 per pupil. The state average is a little over $10,000 a pupil. Moving forward to FY11, North Reading is spending about $12,000 a pupil, and the state average is probably $13,500. So you can kind of see that North Reading's spending is below average, and the source of this bar graph is audited by Department of Education, so I think you can pretty much rely on the validity of the numbers. When you break that down a little bit further, when you try to take the components of North Reading's per pupil spending, it's also interesting to see where we compare against other communities in the various pieces of the per pupil spending mix. Starting at the top, you see administration. North Reading is spending $428 per pupil. The state average is $448, which leads to North Reading being 4% below the state average. The smaller districts tend to be higher in administrative costs because you have an infrastructure that exists regardless of the size of your district. And as you look down here, it's difficult perhaps to see all of these statistics at a quick glance, but I think if you look in the right-hand column, you'll note that North Reading's spending in every single category is below the state average. And there are some rather significant things to look at. When you look at instructional materials in this row here, you can see that we're 40% below the state average. When you look below the next row, the guidance, counseling, and testing row, you see that once again we're spending $262 per pupil, whereas the state average is $371. So regardless of where you go, you'll see that North Reading students and North Reading public is getting a good bang for their buck. So as we move now towards looking at what's contained within the budget, and as you look to reflect on the challenges we've had during this budget season, you'll note that we had 3 fiscal challenges. To begin with, we did not have ARA funds. ARA funds, of course, were made available from the federal government to help school districts across the nation weather the financial crisis. Last year, or this present year, the fiscal year 12 year, we had $339,000 to spend, and as we move towards next year, we'll have 0. We also have a major unknown in this contract, in this budget, and that is the teachers' contract. The school committee is presently negotiating with the teachers' union, and at this stage, we've created a salary pool that is contained within the budget, which represents our best guess for what those costs will be. And thirdly, we're really dealing with an interesting dilemma. Because our priority in this budget and the past 5 years budgets has been to try to maintain our personnel at the present levels. We did not want to reduce classroom teachers. We did not want to reduce the personnel that impacted education. We have intentionally reduced or flatlined the expense budgets that are contained within the schools. And when you do that year after year, you start to get into some problems. And as you can see there, you have an 18% reduction in the expense budgets of the 5 schools over these past 5 years. So let's talk about the overview to this budget structure. Once again, as I've noted, we've level funded expenses pretty much across the board. No inflationary growth, no expansion, no enhancements. Our personnel is down in this budget recommendation by just less than 2 individuals, 2 FTEs, and later on the superintendent will detail those for you. It's also important to note that in this budget, the vision statement, as articulated by the superintendent at the beginning of the school year, is not contained in this budget as a funding request. And we'll have more on that later as well. And lastly, I've noted we've estimated the cost of contracts in the salary pool. So we have a summary here kind of showing some of the details of the FY13 budget, you'll see 4 columns there that represent the 4 fiscal years. You see a column there that shows the change. And let's look at that a little closer. You can kind of see here that the budget request that we're making represents an increase of $1,197,000. It's shown right there in the lower right-hand corner. The majority of that increase is shown above in the salary area. The $1 million figure there represents the delta between next year's request and this present year. And those numbers are primarily driven by collective bargaining contracts. As you can see, the expense budgets are relatively flat. The 4 schools listed in the top part of this yellow box, Batchelder School, Hood School, Little School, Middle School, show a 0 change from year to year. The high school has an increased requested based on some issues we're having in the athletic department and some changes between salary and expense. The actual net change in the high school expense operating budget is 0. We'll detail that later as well. So to illustrate the impact of these expenses over the past 4 years as shown on this slide, you can see at the Batchelder School, the FY10 budget was $99,000. The FY13 budget that we're requesting is down to $84,000. So across the board, you're looking at about a 15% decrease in these expense budgets. That's challenging. So as we move towards the next level of our discussion here, we're hoping to get feedback from the public as to where we move from here. We're looking to work with the town to finalize the available revenue figure. It's in flux a little bit because we're trying to extract all the dollars we can out of all of the available areas. And this is also the time of year where we start to learn what next year's costs are on a definitive basis. As an example, just Friday we learned what the cost was going to be for our tuition assessment for next year's Northeast Regional Vocational School. We had estimated it, now we know what the real number is. So there's a lot of those sort of things going on. But it's our sense that because we budget conservatively, we should be able to move in a positive direction, not a negative direction, as we finish these things off. A week from tonight, the school committee will be in public session to vote a final budget. That budget will then be forwarded to the selectmen and hopefully included on the town meeting omnibus budget for the June town meeting, which is on June the 4th. At the same time, we wait for the state to make its final determinations for what our state aid will be and what our circuit breaker costs will be. There's always a lot of unknowns at this time of the year. I think it's also important at this time to thank the Administrative Council for being here. If we can, would like to use the camera and swing around and introduce them. Starting over here, we have the principal of the middle school, Catherine O'Connell. Beside her, we have Patty Bullard, Director of Pupil Personnel Services. Beside her, we have Patrick Daly, Director of Academic Services. Beside him, we have Sean Killeen, Principal of the Batchelder School. Behind Sean is Mr. Glenn McKay, Principal of the Hood School. And to Glenn's right, John Bernard, Principal of North Reading High School. Thank you for being here. Turn this over to you.
Oh, there's one slide that we didn't go through.
I'm glad the Administrative Council's here too, or otherwise we'll be talking to the wall. Present company excluded. Present company excluded. Well, you guys already know everything anyway. Kathy, do you want to comment?
Well, we have one more slide that we're going to be pulling up so that we can address it in it. This particular slide will detail the preliminary budget and then some of the additions that we made as well as deletions, the adjusted budget, and then the available funds. We've since the preliminary budget was presented to the school committee, the House Ways and Means adjusted or made a recommendation for increases to both Chapter 70 and unrestricted local aid. And so that has changed the bottom line a little bit. So Carl's going to show you that slide and provide that level of detail. And then we'll talk in more specifics around that. Next slide. There we go.
2 minutes. Oh, let me speak to that. Thank you. This was, as we go through the continuum of the budget process, we try to keep a daily track of the vicissitudes that take place and the ups and downs of the budget, and they truly do take place constantly. So what you see in front of you here on the top row is the preliminary budget. When we issued the budget in January, that was the cost that we outlined at that point in time. So that's our starting point. That's our foundation. Since that time, we have made adjustments based on changing needs, changing enrollment patterns, and recognitions of the fact that our preliminary budget was going to be difficult to fund. We will be outlining those shortly. But when you take those additions and deletions, you come up with an adjusted budget of, as shown there, $25,082,721. Below that, you're seeing a figure called available funds. That is the dollar figure that the town of North Reading has stated it can afford to provide to North Reading schools. So when you subtract what's available from what we've needed, we now have a budget gap of about $44,000.
Thank you, Carl. Kathy, you want to talk just briefly about the what makes up the deletions and the additions, just so everybody knows?
Sure.
And they're not significant changes, but I think most of the deletions are based on enrollment.
Yes. When we presented the preliminary budget to the school committee, prior to doing so, we take a look at enrollment and we make adjustments to our personnel based on changes in enrollment as well as changes in need of services. And so we knew that we needed to add some additional special education staff. So you'll see that additions were made to the preliminary budget, and then we needed to make some deletions based on enrollment. So we took a look at some of the art services that were being provided and paring that back based on enrollment, as well as eliminating a grade 5 position at the little school, a grade 1 position at the Hood School, and .2 of a physical education position at the high school. And that's how we arrived at the $25,219,077. Since the preliminary budget was introduced to the school committee, there have been other changes in services that we've needed to address. And so we have added another special education teacher to our PDD program, our pervasive developmental delay. We have been informed that we will have an increase in population that will require the addition of another teacher. And so we have increased that program by 1 special education teacher. We've also added a .5 kindergarten teacher at the Hood School. Again, based on enrollment and class sizes, we have identified the need to add a .5 kindergarten teacher. So we've done so for a total that you can see there of $74,309. Now, in order to make up the budget gap between the funds that are available to us and what we need in order to provide a level services budget, we needed to make some deletions. And so what we did was we again took a look at the current enrollment in our schools, and we determined that we are able to make a reduction to the grade 1 program at the little school, and we were able to reduce the preschool by a .5 teacher at this particular time. That may change based on new information that we receive in the future around additional identified students. Right now, we know that we have a retirement of a custodian for next year. That retirement becomes effective in August. And this year we had a custodian leave because he took a job to become a police officer in Methuen. So we're going to restore one of those custodian positions but eliminate one of those. So that's a savings of $43,000. We'll be reducing our clerical service to the PPS office, and we were restructuring our long-term substitute pay, and we had to discuss that during a budget workshop that will provide an additional savings. We will also be able to carry over funds from FY12 to FY13 based on the mild winter that we've had, as well as the cautious spending of the administration.